Hello, everyone, and welcome to what is the second session of the Create HDR series for this year. My name's Sue Olovich, and it's a real pleasure to be hosting the session today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I work and learn today. I'm on the land of the Darawal people and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I particularly recognise and celebrate the artistic practices of storytelling, of dance, music, and visual art that Indigenous peoples have engaged in for millennia. And I acknowledge how these practices sustain communities, validate experiences, nurture relationships, and serve as essential forms of cultural continuity for First Nations. And finally, I extend deep respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are with us today or watching the recording. And I invite you now to introduce yourselves in the chat. You may wish to acknowledge the land upon which you're joining us from today. So for those of you who are joining for the very first time, our sessions begin with a presentation from a colleague in the field of arts research, and we follow this by a chance to ask questions and share our wonderings and our noticings and our curiosities. And as Zoe's presenting today, you might have some wonderings or questions arise, and I really encourage you to pop them into the chat as they come to mind, and we can explore them after the presentation. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Zoe Hogan. Zoe is a teaching artist and researcher. She's worked in various education and community contexts in Australia, Timor-Leste, Greece, and the UK. As former Director of Education and Community Partnerships at Sydney Theatre Company, Zoe led the delivery of all education and community programs, including the development of the award-winning Connected program, and a book on the program, Connecting Through Drama, Drama and Literacy for Learning English as an Additional Language, co-written with Victoria Campbell, was published by Currency Press. Zoe's also the recipient of the Lloyd Martin Travelling Scholarship for Emerging Arts Leaders from Sydney Opera House. So Zoe's session today will explore teaching artistry as a process of weaving, unweaving, and reweaving. And the metaphor of weaving is intended to invoke an incredibly ordered and meticulous approach to building knowledge, thread by thread, layer by layer. Drawing on the experiences of collaborating on a process drama with community language teachers in Western Sydney, Zoe will present how the process of PhD research facilitated new insights and reflections on the role of the teaching artist in applied theatre and drama in education. So we're really looking forward to your session today, Zoe, and it's a real pleasure to hand over to you to hear from you. So welcome.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you everyone for logging on this afternoon in Sydney time to join in this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional lands of the Wongal people and pay my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first custodians of this land, which has deep roots of multilingualism and storytelling, which as you'll see, is, really central to the research and work that I've been doing. And the next thing I'd like to say just before I get into the presentation is that I'm just recently on the other side of the PhD process, and I just really wanted to thank my wonderful supervisors, Associate Professor Robin Gibson and Professor Emerita Robin Ewing, for getting me through that journey. Today, this is kind of a bit of a reflection for me on some of the learnings and challenges that I've had in the process of doing the PhD, and I will incidentally be talking a lot about a certain figure from an ancient myth and how she came to resonate very deeply with myself as a teaching artist and researcher. And I wanted to kind of begin by talking a little bit about how I came to do a PhD, which I'm not a massive fan of talking about myself, but I know that in these presentations, I find this section a really interesting part, because a lot of people in our field do come to do research through a very through different circuitous routes. So and I think it's probably relevant to how I approach this research as well, as you'll see. So my professional background has been what I think of as quite a non-linear path, in that I was always really involved with theatre making and especially playwriting from quite a young age. And once I started work as an adult, I ended up working in international development and community development in Australia, but also in India and Indonesia and Timor-Leste. And eventually, after a number of years doing that, I wanted to find a way to combine these two loves of mine, so theatre and creativity, and then community development. So I ended up being really lucky to be able to study a master's in theatre and global development at the University of Leeds. And the reason that I ended up all the way over in Leeds was really because it was the only course I could find that really combined these two areas together. And that's where I first learned about facilitation, and it was very focused on those practical skills of bringing groups of people together for creative experiences. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been working in this space that sometimes gets described as drama in education, community arts and cultural development, applied theatre. There's so many different terms that span, such a broad field. So I've been working in schools and juvenile justice centres and hospitals, and with refugee and migrant communities, and many different contexts, but always really enriching work that I feel really honoured to do as a teaching artist. And a central part of that experience was becoming a teaching artist, which was a term that I wasn't actually familiar with at the time, at Sydney Theatre Company on the school drama program, which was initiated by Reweaving. So that's a program, you may be familiar with it, where drama approaches are combined with quality children's literature to support student literacy and also mentor classroom teachers to be able to develop their confidence and capacity to use drama in the classroom. And as a teaching artist on that program, I became really fascinated by the particular resonances of learning in this way for students who were learning English as an additional language. And that kind of led to an exploration with my colleague and collaborator, Victoria Campbell, where we started working with adults learning English as an additional language, and working with story, usually a myth or a folk tale, as a starting point to have a really creative exploration and support people in language learning. So, as I became more and more fascinated by these contexts that I was working in as a teaching artist, I had mentors and colleagues who encouraged me to consider doing research, and also really opened my eyes to the fact that research can be creative and exploratory, and that really piqued my interest. And before you know it, here we are. So a little bit about the research context for my PhD, to kind of set the scene, so to speak. So I ended up partnering with the Sydney Institute of Community Languages Education to work with a group of community languages teachers. So if you're not familiar with the term, it's also called heritage languages in other national contexts, and it's often described as the language associated with one's cultural background. So at least in the Australian context, community languages schools really exist on the periphery of mainstream education. They're not-for-profit schools that are established by migrant communities. They're usually run by women who are also volunteers and usually outside of school hours on the weekends. And really, I think, at least in my case, they're largely invisible to kind of the monolingual mainstream of Australia. And so I was really fortunate to work with 11 community languages teachers who represented Arabic, Lao, Persian, and Uyghur community languages schools across Western Sydney. And I'll talk more about this as we go along, but the research approach was very much rooted in arts-based inquiry with an emphasis on creative and embodied ways of meaning making. And I guess that's because, as you probably realize from my description of my background, I'm really interested in how art can uncover things that are not what Eisner describes as not expressible in ordinary discourse. And I'm really interested in messy and ambiguous moments. So as part of this research group, we worked together for 8 weeks using a process drama based on a myth or a folk tale, so in collaboration with Victoria Campbell. And the idea being that through the process of exploring the myth, we would co-create a new version of that myth that would kind of bear the fingerprints or the creative contributions of everyone involved in that process. And so from the outset, I had a decision to make about the myth or the folk tale that we were going to explore. And I had quite limited information about the participants before I met them and what might resonate with them. So aside from the fact that, of course, they were community leaders through their involvement in establishing and leading community language schools. So with this in mind, I wanted to work with a myth or a folk tale that had a strong female protagonist and preferably a leader at the center of it. Which brings us to Penelope. So you might be familiar with Penelope as almost like a side note in the Odyssey by Homer. So if you're not familiar, that's totally fine. So the Odyssey is about Odysseus, who's a king who has fought in the Trojan War for 10 years. And he goes to return home, but it does take him 10 years to get there because he encounters many challenges along the way. And while this is happening, his wife, Penelope, is waiting at home for 20 years. And Odysseus is assumed dead. And so Penelope has to contend with the many suitors who want to marry her. And she manages to avoid remarriage by telling all of these suitors that she will only remarry when she finishes weaving a funeral shroud for her father-in-law. So she weaves the shroud every day, and then every night she unpicks her weaving, and thus kind of delaying this remarriage. So I love this quote from the original. It says, "This was her latest masterpiece of guile. She set up a great loom in the royal halls, and she began to weave, and the weaving fine spun, the yarns endless, and she would lead us on," which gives you a little sense of the frustration that she was causing these suitors. And Penelope has kind of become synonymous with ideas of patience and fidelity and being a loyal wife. And incidentally, this is just a painting from 1912 by John Waterhouse of Penelope, and it gives us these ideas of, you know, traditional, let's say, feminine attributes that Penelope is often associated with. But I guess what I was really drawn to about this story was not really what was included in the Odyssey, but what wasn't included, which is questions like, how did she adapt to her new role as leader for 20 years while her husband was away? What did she enact and embody over those years while she was in power? And so I was drawn to this myth because of its potential to explore these experiences and qualities of female leadership, which I knew was an experience shared by the participants as teachers and principals and community leaders. And incidentally, I came across a novella which was written by Margaret Atwood, which retells the story from Penelope's point of view in, comic and ironic genius, as you can imagine. And I love this quote from the beginning of the novella. It says, "Now that all the others have run out of air, it's my turn, so I'll spin a thread of my own." So, in developing this process drama, I usually focus on key moments in a story where a protagonist will take action or face an important decision. And even though there was so much that was compelling to me about Penelope, I was a little bit concerned about this act of weaving and unweaving that is really central to her story. But essentially, it was going to be a protagonist repeating the same action again and again, with the goal of not producing anything, not enacting any change. And I thought this is going to be interesting, facilitating a drama which includes this as kind of a central moment. But having said that, I did a lot of reading, as we do, and kind of came to understand that this unweaving can also be read as an act of deviation or subversion, and because it is a form of labor that resists the pressure of completion. And Shoichet describes how this is kind of an act of agency and that it is done in a wholly duplicitous manner and arguably undoing her womanly virtues as she resists the social role cast for her. So kind of invoking this metaphor of weaving is not intended to evoke this idea of free-flowing, unbridled creativity, because I think, as Sue mentioned in the intro, it is really, weaving is a way of imposing order. It's creating a complex structure for creativity. And it's ordered and meticulous. And so, as I'll explain, this came to be a really helpful touchstone for me as I went through the research process. Sorry. I just wanted to kind of focus now on the process of preparing for data collection and what that data collection actually ended up looking like. So obviously in arts-based inquiry, arts-based inquiry can be used at certain points in the research process to generate data, to interpret data, and then to communicate the findings or the new knowledge, as Knowles and Cole describe. But given, I guess I was really interested in how could I use arts-based inquiry to inform and infuse every single stage of the research process, from the delivery of the workshops themselves through to data collection and analysis, and then sharing the findings. So this diagram was my initial kind of attempt to understand the process of data collection. And you'll see that it started with pre-program interviews through to the drama workshops, which had a few different aspects of data collection that I would collect along the way, and then followed by post-program interviews. And then the idea was that I would go away and kind of collate these findings into an ethnodrama script, which would then be presented back to the participants. And I guess the intention with this process was that each step would support and complement the other data collection modes and provide really rich cross-sectional data to elucidate participant experiences. As with, most things, when you embark on a process, it becomes much more complex, and you realize that the beginning and the end aren't these fixed points. And so I found it much more helpful as I went along to understand the data collection process as a rhizomatic process rather than the linear one, which I showed on the slide before. And I think it offers a helpful visual metaphor for the fact that the research process, like I said, it doesn't begin or end anywhere in particular, and neither are data collection and data analysis these separate and neatly demarcated processes. But as St. Pierre and Jackson describe, it's happening everywhere and all the time. And so I think for drama practitioners and teaching artist researchers, the concept of above and below ground that the rhizome offers us is also a helpful way of thinking about aspects of the creative process that are external and can be tangible and visible to an onlooker or an audience, such as a script or a workshop or a written chapter. And then all of those things that are internal or underground, which are, the myriad conversations, the expressions, the observations that a creative work is rooted in and nourished by. And so I ended up adding other aspects of data collection and meaning making that I hadn't initially planned for, which included things like analytic memos that I wrote in the writing process, the theoretical readings, the ongoing relationships with participants that kind of spilled out of and beyond the workshops themselves. So I wanted to kind of fast forward now to after the drama workshops had been completed, because I thought it might be, interesting for other people who are embarking on research, because you obviously end up with hours and hours of, in my case, video recordings of workshops and discussions, and you've got your recordings of the interviews and then the discussions with my co-facilitator after every workshop, and then all of the artifacts that had been produced through the workshops. And so I kind of sat down at that point and began this process of coding, which is familiar to many qualitative researchers. And this is where we kind of privilege the application of broad categories and systematic processes that can really enable you to process large amounts of data in different formats. And incidentally, I've used coding in other research projects and really enjoyed it. When I sat down to do it, in this case, it quickly became apparent that applying distinct categories was lacking the nuance to reflect how participants' experiences and then their reflections on those experiences obviously contained threads of two or more categories at once. And even, I guess, more crucially for me, it also felt like a relatively blunt instrument to understand the variety of the data. So, for example, I had all of these transcripts of interviews which were really meaningful, but through the coding process, those interviews kept being centered because they were easier to code than, for example, embodied expressions and artifacts that were created through the workshop. So I felt like the focus of the research was being pulled in a direction that didn't feel authentic. And Bagnoli also says that analytic approaches to qualitative research do tend to privilege voice as the medium to convey experience. Whereas we know, as arts practitioners, there's a whole range of ways of conveying experience. And so I kind of began to feel that coding was in some ways antithetical to these deeply embodied and affective ways of meaning making in which we'd been immersed during the workshops. So it was around this time that I came across a branch of post-qualitative inquiry, specifically an article titled Qualitative Data Analysis After Coding by St. Pierre and Jackson, which I have in my reference list at the end if anyone's interested. And so this kind of opened my eyes really and led me to diffractive analysis, which is to read data with theoretical concepts. So it requires you to engage in an event of reading and becoming with, described by Haraway, rather than reading the data from a distance and as separate or apart from it. And so this obviously resonated with me as a teaching artist researcher because it acknowledges that the data itself works with and upon the researcher, even as the researcher is working with the data. And the fact that as a researcher, you are being influenced by the data as you're analysing it. So Jackson and Matzai describe how threading through data into theory into data can result in multiplicity and ambiguity, which are things that I think I mentioned before I'm really fascinated with and continue to be fascinated by. So I guess in a circuitous way, which you can see is the way that I work through everything, as a metaphor for analysis, I think it also really resonates with this figure of Penelope, who is constantly unweaving and reweaving, making, unmaking, undoing, and redoing. And so now on a practical level, what this looked like in my thesis is that I looked very deeply at 3 specific moments in workshops, which were complemented by some other key moments. And this approach has been used elsewhere by applied theatre researchers such as Penny Bundy and Erica Piazzoli. And I felt like it really lent itself to the specificity of arts-rich experiences. So very briefly, and I won't go into this whole level of detail, but just to give you a sense of how these, what I ended up referring to as threads of meaning, emerged through this data analysis process. So it was partly through, of course, immersing myself in the data and the theory, but also, I have to say, by drawing upon an intuitive understanding as a teaching artist, which is probably, a whole other discussion, that these threads of meaning really emerge. So along the top level of this slide are quotes from participants, from workshop and interviews, and then along the bottom in bold how these themes were also reflected and refracted in the story of Penelope, which was obviously developing as we were going through the workshop. So just as an example, one thread of meaning that emerged early on was that participants were engaging in the workshops as teachers, but they were also engaging as artists. So one participant described this as, so we have this wonderful group that we just leak water and it's whoosh, a drip of ink, and then whoa, to describe the process of how a creative idea can just catch on and carry everyone along with it. And then this was kind of also reflected in the story of Penelope, where we discovered that not only is she a talented weaver, Homer tells us that, but in our version, she decorated the castle with beautiful weavings and plants, and she also taught other women in her community how to weave. And that obviously really reflected the participants in the group. And so when these personal and artistic aspects of the data became diffracted through the theory and the readings, these evolved into threads of meaning that took shape into engagement and theories of flow and affect, care, and third space. And these kind of became, I guess, what you call my findings chapters in the finished thesis. And I know I'm kind of like just brushing over these, but I thought it might be helpful to give people an idea of this process that I went on that was definitely not what I had expected or planned for. So just to go back quickly, and I hope I'm not belaboring the point, to this idea of weaving and unweaving and reweaving, it kind of, as I mentioned, it became the central metaphor for how I experienced the research as an iterative process of learning and unlearning and revisiting and reconceiving of what I thought I knew about both teaching artistry and research. And so I kind of created this visual to try to, I guess, tell this story of the process that I went on as a researcher. So to kind of map it alongside Penelope's story. So in weaving, she weaves a funeral shroud, which is a very familiar task to her. And similarly, I was co-facilitating process drama workshops, which was a fairly familiar task to me with support from my co-facilitator. And then when Penelope unweaves her work every night, you can imagine the tangled, difficult, time-consuming mess this would have become to unweave, especially through the night. And again, if there's any PhD or master's research students listening to this, I think you might relate to that idea of trying to untangle threads of meaning and things get tangled, and it can be a very time-consuming process. And then back to Penelope's story with reweaving. So every day she would reweave this shroud, and through doing that reweaving, she was buying herself time and freedom. And so for me, I guess writing the ethnodrama and the findings were a process of interweaving data and theory and my own subjectivity in a way that with that grey arrow that kind of is going beyond the diagram, it's kind of trying to suggest that this is an ongoing process that obviously goes beyond the scope of the thesis and the PhD. It has no set end point and is something that I think will continue shaping my teaching artist practice in future. And so I guess I was going to say in conclusion, but I don't really love summing things up in neat and pithy sentences. So really, I just wanted to reflect that this process of research, and particularly the unweaving and reweaving these findings through diffractive analysis resulted in, a lot of multiplicity and ambiguity, and I guess continually unfolding reflections on my practice as a teaching artist. And yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to finish the presentation. I do have a little reference list here if that's useful for anyone. And incidentally, this is the back of some embroidery that I've done, which kind of shows the messy work behind creative work. Yeah.
Oh, Zoe, I so enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much. And can you join with me in thanking Zoe for presenting today? Um, Feel free, we're a small group this afternoon, and this morning for those of you who are overseas. Feel free to unmute if you like, and we can start to share some of our wonderings and our curiosities. I'm curious, Zoe, was there anything that surprised you in this messy journey of the PhD research?
I guess I didn't realize when I set out on the process that there is this really rich body of literature and work that is questioning some of these established ways of doing research, and this idea that, on a simplistic level, that research leads us to certainty. And I guess that was a really nice discovery to make along the way, because I had already this interest in, how you tolerate ambiguity as a teaching artist, and you try to make spaces where people can question and notice things. And I think through the PhD process, I've only become, I guess I've learned a lot more about that, and I can now situate that practice in a lot of other people's work and academic and practice-based work. And I think that's given me, I guess, more confidence in that approach.
Yeah. And I guess it's represented by that grey arrow that's moving beyond into the new space, and the representative of new learning and the unknown. I'd love to throw over to anyone who's with us here in the Zoom room. You may have a comment, a noticing, something you're curious about, something you were wondering about as you were listening to Zoe present. Feel free just to unmute.
I'll jump in. Hi, Zoe.
Hello, familiar face.
I'm sort of a bit familiar with the research, I think. But I thought it was interesting. You started the presentation by talking about messiness, and you finished it by talking about messiness. So what was the messiest moment in this research for you?
Gosh, there's plenty to choose from, but I'll just go with the first that popped into my mind, which is one of those specific moments that I wrote about in the thesis, which was a moment in the workshop where we were all so invested in this story of Penelope. Her husband had just returned home, and as a teaching artist, I guess I realized, wow, there is so much engagement and affect in this space, and it felt like, a powder keg about to explode. And there's a lot of work that, Gavin Bolton has done about protecting participants into emotion in a drama space. And I guess in that moment, you make choices about how to guide people through that emotional process and out the other side. And it was something that I spent a lot of time reflecting on as a teaching artist, because we're often working so hard to engage participants that we think less about how to guide them through and out of that engagement, and that can be just as important to do carefully. So yeah, that was just one moment that was messy in the room, and I think on reflection I would probably manage it a bit differently, but that is one of the wonderful things about doing practice-based research, is that you can really deeply reflect on moments like that and learn from them in a hopefully a way that will develop your practice in future.
Beautiful. I can see that Margie's added something in the comments here. She says that she loved listening about your research. Tolerating ambiguity, indeed, and the messiness is always a part of the creativity. And she particularly loved the rhizomatic process imagery. And she's saying congratulations. Thanks, Margie, for sharing that. And adding on to what Robin's curiosity was, I was interested in the fact that it was messy, but there was at the same time, it was very ordered, and that they actually sat your approaches to data collection and the way that you represented that for us. There was this idea that the messiness and incredible order and attention to detail could sit quite comfortably together. I found really, really interesting. Would anyone else like to ask a question or make a comment? Feel free to be comfortable and to unmute.
Hi, thank you so much, Zoe. It was wonderful listening to you.
Thanks, Stephen.
I'm right at the very beginning of all of this, but what I was very interested in there was I work with dance, and for many years I've been working in primary schools here in Ireland, and I'm hoping to do research based around what I know as a dancing teacher, how that can help generalist teachers, because they need to include dance. And that's kind of the start of what I'm doing. But what was interesting, you were talking about, you focused on 8 workshops, and then you've opened this up, this massive. And my initial proposal has been to focus on 10 weeks. So it's a similar, to go in each week for 10 weeks. I'm working in a school where I've been working for 20 years almost, So I'm looking at it in different ways at the moment, but I say I'm a real beginner, but I'm looking at it because I'm interested to know in this school how they've normalized dance in their life. To be there are parents I've taught of children, that kind of way, it's primary school. So that's one way I'm looking at that, and then I'm trying to stay calm, because I'm listening to you, and the language is something I've got to grow accustomed to, and all of this. So how can you have just this 8 weeks and you can draw so much? Where does the time come from? Did you have other workshops going on at the same time? I've got so many questions I want to ask in a very practical way, So I just thank you so much. I'm writing and listing, and there's 25 million things I want to ask.
Yeah. But no, I think I did just want to say though, Stephen, because I think it is hard for when obviously you've got so much experience that has led to this moment of doing research. And I felt like, to a much lesser extent, that, I had done so many process dramas with groups of adults before, and I'd worked with this approach of using myths, and it had really developed over time with Victoria Campbell. And then it comes to the moment of doing research, and it's just in my case, with the one group, and these moments that I've analysed in my thesis, can be 2, 3, 7 minutes long. But I guess at least I brought, and you would as well, you bring your entire kind of professional and artistic experience to bear on those moments. So it's like this really weird tension between the specificity of the work that you're researching next to all of the experience that's led you to that moment. I'm not answering any kind of question, but I just wanted to say, like, I really get that it feels weird to suddenly, like, this is the moment that you're researching. I don't know if, Robin, you have anything to add to that as my supervisor.
I think as supervisors, we just try to bring you back onto a path. And if Zoe had said, well, I'd like this to go on for 20 weeks, we would have sort of said, well, how much data do you actually want? And how you sort of, so I think it's how long is a piece of string? I mean, Zoe had to make a decision about how long was this going to go, how long was the duration of the workshops, how much, I mean, when she started collecting data, and she's talking about lots of different sources and then trying to make sense of all that. I mean, it has to be something that's feasible. And I think that's one of the roles of a supervisor, is to make sure that she survives the journey. I mean, you know, and she did very well.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, I have a wonderful with supervisor, and I'm going to see her later on today. And I'm really at the outset, so I feel very thankful and privileged that, you know, I can be included in this and just let everything go over me. There was, I'm rambling, but what was
me too, Stephen.
What was also, it was just, there was something I wrote down, I thought that's really, really important. And it was this kind of like looking at how much meaning you were getting out of the embodied experience of autism, which is massive for me, you know, because I'm reading all those bits. You know, anyway, I'll leave off there and let somebody else talk. But thank you so much. Yeah.
Just on that point, though, Stephen, I think it's really interesting to think about all of the things that don't get captured in a recording because they're limited. And in my case, working with, you know, well, anyone who is working with participants who are expressing their experience in a language that is not their first, because if we only privilege those text-based forms of data, you're missing so much richness. So yeah, it was something I was very mindful of throughout that process.
Thanks for the question, Stephen. And Jeremy's written in the comments, thank you, Zoe. What a magnificent odyssey for you. Your presentation has given me a lot of ways to think about my own research project too, which is fantastic. And thank you for all the delicious messiness. And congratulations to you. So some lovely feedback there for you, Zoe, as well. So in rounding up today's session, so enjoyed the conversation that we've had afterwards and the ability to reflect. Are there any final thoughts or comments or feedback that anyone would like to share? Just some heart emojis to thank you there, Zoe. Well, Zoe, a big thank you. I so enjoyed listening to your presentation this afternoon, and I know that I reflect all of us here in the Zoom room. It was a beautiful presentation, and one that I think will be so helpful to many of us who are at different stages along the journey, to hear your reflections on your experience. And I'm curious, in just finishing up your beautiful tapestry at the very end, my wondering, as you showed that to us, was, did you create that throughout your research journey, or was that something that you'd created at another time, or was that something that represents that grey arrow of after you completed that it became something that you wanted to create?
It is a piece that I was working on while I was writing up the chapters, and incidentally, like, obviously making something with your hands and something really detailed like embroidery was quite a therapeutic thing to be doing through the process. So I would recommend it to people if they're interested.
Yeah, and what a beautiful parallel to what was your research journey. Zoe, a big thank you. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. Our very next session will be in about a month's time on the 26th of September. Same Zoom link to access. Terry Elliott is going to be presenting her research during that session. So keep an eye out for the Create newsletter, and you'll have a little synopsis of that session. I know it's going to be another wonderful one. So thank you to all of you. I know that some of you have joined from different parts of the world in order to be here today. Big thank you for joining. Go well, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.